Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of 5 events organized by the Center for American Studies to mark the upcoming US election. Some of you might know me already, but for those who don't, I'm Zalfa Fagali. I'm a lecturer in American literature with the Center for American Studies and the School of Arts. And I'm down to be moderating this evening's event, as well as trying to make my own contribution at the end, just a short one. So tonight we're talking about gender and voting rights. And over the next 4 Thursdays, various colleagues from the Center for American Studies will be returning right here to this link to discuss the US election and the Americas, to discuss the US election and Black Lives Matter, and of course, giving you some pre-election analysis, hopefully some useful predictions, and some post-election analysis, whatever that will mean. So I want to thank all of our contributors in advance, but in particular, our 2 contributors today for taking the plunge and going first, as well as everyone who's turned up this evening. I'm genuinely delighted to see so many initials, I suppose, on my screen. So before we get properly started, just a few words about etiquette, I think. So you'll have heard that this event is being recorded, so please act accordingly. One of the things that we've seen in the run-up to this election is the habit of candidates or their supporters, these candidates having louder or more self-entitled voices to just decide to speak over other people. But we're not like that. So we show them how it's done. We're going to have 3 short talks, and I'd ask you during these short talks to keep your microphones muted, please, which you all seem to have done, to minimize echo and general confusion. And after the talks are done, we'll open up the floor for general discussion, whether that's in the chat box or whether you'd like to unmute yourself and actually ask a question. We also just want it to be a forum for discussion, so don't feel like you have to direct a question to anyone in specific. No matter what your views are or how strongly you feel them in one direction or another, please ask your questions respectfully and you will, I'm sure, get respectful answers. So get yourselves on mute. You already have. I'll move to introducing tonight's speakers. I'm just delighted to have you all here and delighted to introduce my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Clapp from History. She's an associate professor in American history and her research is in the field of 19th century American women's history. She is the perfect person to speak to us today as we think about women and voting rights. Alongside Elizabeth is Ellen Morgan. I'm so glad we're recording this. The other perfect person to speak to us today. Ellen is writing her PhD here at Leicester, also in history, and she's working on the traditions and political processes of civil rights memorialization in the US South, focusing on civil rights era white women's activism, which is way too smart for me. Elizabeth and Ellen are going to do the really interesting stuff. I'll speak at the end about Amy Coney Barrett and what role she might play in the relationship between women's votes and women's reproductive rights. So a content warning there, but I'm going to be talking about abortion. But enough from me now. I'll hand over to Elizabeth.
Hello, and thank you, Zalfa, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who's come along today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the background to women's involvement in politics, specifically throughout the long 19th century. So in case you've forgotten, given everything else that has happened this year, we are marking the centennial of the 19th Amendment to the US Federal Constitution, the amendment that granted women the right to vote in American elections. What I'd like to explore for a few minutes, and I hope I'm not going to be too long about this, is first of all some historical background to that amendment. Secondly, the grounds on which women gained the right to vote. Thirdly, the extent to which it gave all women the right to vote. And finally, the extent to which it was a victory for equality. So the historical background, first of all. Since the very foundations of the American Republic, women have been involved in politics, broadly defined, with varying degrees of influence. Their participation in many of the protests during the revolutionary struggle meant that from the beginning, women's exclusion from formal politics was not a foregone conclusion. There was some debate as to what female citizenship might mean in the new republic. Those debates brought women no political rights, except very briefly in New Jersey, but it did create a clear definition of what a woman's role should be in the new republic. That role was as the Republican mother or wife, defining women's relationship to the state as that of a wife and mother. Her primary role was to nurture good Republican citizens, that is, their sons and their husbands. As such, women were to be valued as the protectors of Republican values and the nurturers of male citizens. For some women, that role could be very influential, and elite women participated in politics in informal ways. At a time when the electoral franchise was quite restricted, some elite women possibly wielded much more influence than white men who didn't own property, and certainly much more than African American men. That changed in the 1820s and 30s when most states revised their franchise, resulting in universal white manhood suffrage, a move that made the distinction between white male and female citizenship really stark. Those changes also made the electoral franchise, in other words the vote, a key determinant of American citizenship, making those who could not exercise that privilege, particularly women, the majority of African Americans and certainly Native Americans, second-class citizens. The move reinforced the idea of what had been called the separation of spheres, that men occupied the public sphere, that is business and politics, women the private, the home and the family. While women could not vote and were supposedly confined to the home, throughout the 19th century, many middle-class women, both white and indeed African American, were involved in informal means of political activism. So you see women involved in things like reform movements, notably temperance, moral reform and anti-slavery before the Civil War. They're involved in supporting the Civil War during the conflict, and in the later part of the 19th century they're also involved in pushing for many social welfare reforms. In participating in such activism, respectable middle-class women were often motivated by what they perceived as their feminine characteristics, in other words, their gendered roles. They used their piety, their virtue, and their role as the protectors of the home as both a motive for and a justification of their activism. And many of those activities were clearly outside what was perceived as their natural sphere, but still they justified their involvement in these activities as part of their female role as wives and mothers. So can I move on now to look at what this actually has to do with elections and how women actually got the vote? So I want to talk briefly about the women's suffrage movement. It starts off as the women's rights movement, and that's usually dated by historians from the first Women's Rights Convention held at Seneca Falls in Upper New York State in July 1848. While drawing on some of the same groups as the early 19th century reform movements, most notably the anti-slavery and temperance activists, women's rights activists swept aside notions of their sphere to demand a much fuller part in American civil and political life. By the time of the Civil War, their demands had become focused on securing the vote for women on the grounds of their equality with men. It remained a minority movement, shocking mid-19th century society, which feared that by granting the women the vote, families would be broken up, the world would be turned upside down, and women would become the same as men. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, women's rights activists sought to gain the vote for women alongside the demands for full citizenship rights for the freed men. The debates over the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution split the alliance between abolitionists and women's rights advocates, leading to the creation of two independent women's suffrage organizations. Though they differed in their methods and the breadths of their demands, These two organisations campaigned for women's rights to vote through the latter half of the century. They did gain some victories in some of the Western states, but progress was slow. And in 1890, they came together to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which eventually secured the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. Over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the suffrage movement gained new supporters and shifted the grounds on which it demanded the vote. While many suffragists still pushed for the vote on the grounds of their equality with men, others began to draw on the same kind of arguments that had long been used by women to justify their involvement in reform, that women's special qualities as mothers and the protectors of the home in the changed circumstances of industrial America meant that they needed the vote to fulfill their role. Increasingly, white suffragists used the rhetoric of women's sphere to demand the vote. While certainly more militant suffragists continued to assert their equality with men, the language of women's sphere probably persuaded more Americans to change their mind on the question. So who actually got the vote in 1920? The 19th Amendment states, quote, that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So what the 19th Amendment does, certainly, is to give the right to vote to all white women over the age of 21, and indeed some women had already exercised that right to vote for some time. But it excluded some groups of women, most notably African American women in the South, who couldn't vote any more than their men could until 1965. On top of that, some women continued to oppose the suffrage and did not vote in protest against the 19th Amendment. But did the vote actually recognise the equality of women in American society? Quite patently, it didn't. It didn't bring other citizenship rights with it, nor did it bring equality in other aspects of women's lives. It didn't, for instance, allow them entry into the professions. It didn't bring them equal pay, workplace equality, legal rights, etc., etc., etc. There was an attempt to secure an Equal Rights Amendment in 1923, introduced by Alice Paul, who had led the militant wing of the suffrage movement, but it was defeated, partly because of a split among suffragists themselves over the question of protecting women's special qualities. Nor did it create a women's voting bloc. That is, the idea that there would be a woman's vote to which politicians could appeal, and that there were women's issues common to all women focused on the protection of the home and the family, issues that are very, very different today. Politicians quickly realised that the so-called women's vote was not going to materialise, partly because, at least initially, more conservative women simply didn't vote, but also because many women voted the same way as their male relatives. It hasn't stopped politicians trying to appeal to the women's vote, but women are no more united on the issues that concern them than are men. During the 1920s, emerging feminism, which demanded equality and many women's rights, was tarred by anti-communist propaganda and caught up in the Red Scare of the early 1920s. It was not an atmosphere in which the electoral franchise might be used to push for further reforms that might have brought a greater degree of equality between men and women. Meaning that although women might have gained the vote, without a united women's movement, they did not have the electoral influence that might have produced greater equality. Thank you.
I feel like I should clap, but that wouldn't mean anything. Sorry.
Thank you, Safa.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Right, moving on closer, a little bit closer to our contemporary moment. I think we've got a really good chronology going here. Ellen, would you like to take it away? Ellen has a PowerPoint that she's going to attempt to share, and it takes a couple of minutes to load, so I will just speak about nothing and anything while this happens, hopefully. I think one of the key questions, Elizabeth, that I didn't expect you to ask, just because it wasn't what I was thinking about, was did it bring equality? So, you know, of course the answer is no. Civic rights are not just about the vote, are they? Getting close, Ellen?
Yeah, it says it's nearly loaded, sorry.
All right. So we're hoping that everyone can see the slides when they do get shared. But if you can't, apologies, and we will hopefully either be able to share them, or I'm sure you'll be able to listen along. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, sorry.
Perfect. Go for it.
Okay, hello everyone. As Zelda said, I'm Ellen. I'm currently a second year PhD student. My research is mainly based on the civil rights movement and female activism, but today I'm going to be focusing on informal methods of political involvement, in particular Virginia Foster Durr and the old anti-poll tax movement. In 1959, Ralph McGill wrote, "To have been and to be a Southerner in all these years is the finest sort of luck, but I know from being with them that to be a young Southerner is the most delightful, mystical and wonderful agony of it all." Such a description would certainly characterize Virginia Foster Durr's feeling towards her Southern heritage. In 1903, Durr was born in Birmingham, Alabama. The third child of a Presbyterian minister, her family was very much considered the old ruling class of Southern gentry. In many ways, her childhood was a product of white privilege and was largely dictated by the unspoken etiquette of racial inequality. Yet as Durr grew older, she also recognized the wonderful agony of it all, and in turn decided to dedicate the majority of her life to recognizing the hypocrisies and correcting the injustices of Southern American life. Originally enacted in response to the populist revolt of the 1890s, the poll tax proved to be an effective measure to restrict certain groups who were deemed a threat to the status quo of Southern American life, a chance to vote. Not only did the poll tax disenfranchise poor whites and African Americans, but it also severely hindered female agency in Southern politics. In her autobiography, Outside the Magic Circle, Durr speaks extensively about how the poll tax, meaning a tax which must be paid in order for an individual to vote at any given election, hindered Southern women from voting. Durr talks about how once married, her husband Clifford Durr was required to back pay $15 in order for Virginia to vote. In 1932, 10 southern states levied a poll tax. In Alabama, for example, the tax was $1.50, which you can see from the poll receipt on the slide. So $1.50 in 1932 is equivalent to about $26.40 today. So as you can imagine, that being back paid from anywhere from 3 years ago to anywhere since an individual turned 21 could easily add up for anybody who perhaps was on a lower income or didn't earn at all. Furthermore, in Alabama, as well as Mississippi and Virginia, the poll tax was retroactive, meaning an individual would have to back pay their poll tax in order to vote in any given election. So upon learning that a key aim of an organisation called the Women's Division for Democratic National Committee was to get rid of a poll tax so white Southern women could vote, Durs decided to volunteer. However, Jimmy Farley, the chairman of the Democratic Committee, ultimately told the Women's Division that they had to cease their campaign against the poll tax. According to Durr, the challenge to the patriarchal South proved simply too radical for them to accept. In 1938, inspired by the reformist atmosphere of the New Deal, the Southern Conference for Human Welfare was formed in Birmingham, Alabama. With the intentions of promoting civil liberties and combating economic problems within the context of the US South, the organisation fought to establish a South built on interracial cooperation and economic renewal. Linda Reed, a leading historian on the movement, characterised the Southern Conference for Human Welfare as a progressive movement of the 1930s and likened it to the abolitionists, the populists and the muckrakers of the progressive era, as, because she explains, each group, like the Southern Liberals, foresaw and anticipated resolutions to grave social problems the federal government eventually began addressing. The Southern Conference for Human Welfare immediately attracted Virginia Durr's attention. Included in their agenda was a cause that Durr championed for the following decades, the fight against the poll tax. So in 1941, with the support of the Southern Conference for Human Welfare, a national committee to abolish the poll tax was formed, largely due to Durr's efforts. Over the following few years, Durr, now elected vice chairman, directed the work of the committee in order to persuade Congress to abolish the poll tax. The image on the slide shows Durr, on the right, handing a certificate of appreciation to US Representative George H. Bender, a Republican from Ohio, for his authorship of an anti-poll tax bill at a convention in Washington, D.C. Although the National Committee to Abolish the Poll Tax collapsed in November of 1948, it did succeed in altering public opinion in the South against poll tax. In the same year, Durr ran for US Senate from Virginia on the Progressive Party ticket platform. Although Durr finished behind the Democratic and the Republican nominees, she was able to raise awareness of the problem of poll tax, as well as issues such as civil and labour rights. During the 1950s, the poll tax battle still occupied much of Durr's attention. In 1959, in a letter written to Clark Foreman, a New Deal administrator under the Roosevelt administration, Durr writes how she was pleased to see Lyndon Johnson's support of a federal anti-poll tax amendment, despite it being 25 years too late. The anti-poll tax campaign of the 1940s and 50s was successful in a few southern states, but ultimately failed at a national level. It wasn't until the 24th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1964 that poll taxes were abolished at a national level. Furthermore, the poll taxes at a state level were finally abolished in 1966 as a result of US Supreme Court decisions, all of which I'm sure wouldn't have been achieved without Virginia Foster Durr's efforts. So thank you for listening. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. I didn't know that this woman existed, so now I do. But no, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ellen. Do you want to unshare your screen
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. But yeah, if anybody has questions for either Elizabeth or Ellen, you can start. I won't be very long in my talk, so you can start typing them into the chat now. That's absolutely fine. Or save them if you're feeling brave and would like to actually come on screen or use your vocal cords. So Elizabeth gave us a sense of the 19th Amendment and its development and how women's rights were, well, women's rights to citizenship were defined by this right to vote, but it didn't necessarily bring equality, as we know, as we learned last election, really. And Ellen discussed Virginia Foster Durr, who I've now admitted I didn't know existed, and commented, I think, really interestingly on the unspoken etiquette of racial inequality in the South, as well as gendered inequality more broadly. And so the poll tax that she was talking about may not exist today because of that 24th Amendment, but there are clear structures of disenfranchisement still in place today that we can list really easily and are at the tip of our tongues. So what I'm going to do just for a couple of minutes is talk to you about, I guess, a vaguely related issue here in terms of a specific kind of women's rights and gender equality. And we'll see how we can kind of bring all of these talks together when you ask your questions. So do start typing now if that's what you want to do. I have no slides, so you will just have to look at my face and listen to my voice with my condolences there. So soon after Donald Trump's presidential inauguration in January 2017, when, by the way, the Center for American Studies put on an Obama-Palooza Festival of Obama Appreciation at exactly the same time the inauguration was taking place. And in response to a range of articles citing evidence that the president does not read books, anti-Trump protesters began to make plans to bury the White House in literary texts that engage with some of the 45th president's more divisive and exclusionary policy issues. Frequently appearing on these reading lists is writing by 19th century abolitionist and women's rights activist Frederick Douglass, who Trump famously and stupidly described as an example of someone who's doing an amazing job and is getting recognized more and more. Another one of the books was by Canadian author Margaret Atwood, and that's her 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, a book set in a dystopian near future New England, where women are socially, politically, and sexually subjugated under a theonomy premised on Old Testament inspired religious fanaticism. As time's passed, The Handmaid's Tale has been consistently returned to, even a few days ago, in some of the articles I was reading, as a touchstone for the erosion of a range of rights and freedoms in the United States. And I want to return to it today as an entry point into thinking about the Trump administration's nomination and what seems like the imminent confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the US Supreme Court. So there's a decent amount of things to say about Barrett as a judge, whether we think about her stance on gun control or her stance on immigration or her stance on healthcare or her religious beliefs influencing her judicial opinions in the time and before the time she was appointed by the Trump administration as a judge on the Chicago-based 7th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. But what most people have focused on is Barrett's position on women's reproductive rights and how this position is pretty much diametrically opposed to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So that's what I'm going to focus on too, in part because the statistics around the women's vote or the white women's vote in 2016 were, and this is of course a very scholarly term here, a huge gut punch to many of us. And of course, women tend to be the primary, and I'm using the term women here as broadly and inclusively as I intend to, primary beneficiaries of protected reproductive rights. So pro-choice groups have expressed concern that if she were appointed, Barrett could help overturn the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion rights across the United States. And although Barrett has not ruled directly on abortion as a judge, the evidence we see on this is that her voting record signals her opposition to rulings that struck down abortion-related restrictions. Now, there's a lot of double negatives in there. So to paraphrase, the concern is around Barrett's record that suggests she will seek to reinstate restrictions around abortion. So I framed the start of this talk around a novel, which is probably a clue to those of you who have never seen me before today, that I'm primarily a literary critic, or a literature person, as I like to say. So the next bit of this talk, I want to think briefly about literature and the law, specifically around Barrett's approach to the interpretation of the law. Barrett is seen by many as what some critics have called the mirror image of late Justice Antonin Scalia, famous for his deep friendship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, but also equally, probably more famous for his conservative approach to constitutional interpretation. Barrett, like Scalia, is seen as an originalist or textualist. It's an approach that looks strictly at the text of the Constitution or legal statute and tries to apply original intention from the framers. So I don't have a fundamental objection to this in principle. In literary studies, we call this close textual analysis, and that's useful sometimes. In fact, those of you who've ever taken any sort of literature degree in American studies at Leicester will have come across a passage analysis or a close textual analysis. But it is not the point of why we do literature. What textualism implies is that the meaning of the law can be found nowhere except in that text, so the statute or the Constitution. By this logic, once a court has ascertained the plain meaning of a statute, nothing else in legislative history becomes relevant. Everything else is irrelevant. So not even to be consulted. So if we applied this for a moment to the study of literary text, we might compare textualism to new criticism, a way of reading that focuses, again, only on the text, not its context, not the history around it, nothing, just the text. So anyone who's ever read any book or even the manual for your electric kettle knows that it's crucial to consider history, consider context, consider what plug you have, and consider pre-existing knowledge to achieve a full and textured understanding of that book or that manual. And I know fictional books aren't the law, but if we follow the logic, the law is unbending. It's free of context. It's absolute. And this is problematic, of course, because human beings are not that at all. Our lives are not unbending. We have context. We are not absolute. We are not unchanging. We are not maths equations. And in fact, even maths equations change. So if this is the case about textualism, and Barrett is a textualist, and a textualist takes up Ginsburg's vacant space, then people concerned for the safety of laws around reproductive rights should be concerned, and rightly so, because there is no explicit mention of these rights in the Constitution. As you know, the Roe v. Wade decision hinged on the right of privacy and personal liberty found in the 14th and 9th Amendments. And this isn't just about Barrett, right? It's worth asking ourselves why people were relying on an 87-year-old woman with pancreatic cancer to hold on to the rights afforded to women by Roe v. Wade. And the answer is that it was just an illusion. Those rights have been actively eroded for a long time, beginning just a few years after the Roe v. Wade decision. Not everyone has the same access to reproductive health care, and healthcare is another issue that we can talk about in the United States and the election. Not everyone has the same access to insurance that will cover abortions. And of course, this more often than not has an impact on the poor and women of color. And state after state, including Louisiana, West Virginia, Tennessee, Alabama, both Dakotas, have been busy trying to pass or successfully passing laws that will make it easier to eventually ban abortion in those states if Roe v. Wade is overturned, even going as far as declaring fetuses full human beings so that a pregnant person who loses an unborn child can get charged with a crime. Take the case of Marsha Jones in 2019, a Black woman who faced manslaughter charges because she miscarried after being shot in the stomach. So all of this is to say that Barrett's potential confirmation has the potential not only to erode reproductive rights, but also to affect voter patterns. 52% of women think that abortion is a really important topic when they decide on who to vote for. So Atwood's Handmaid's Tale may have been fictional, but it's become eerily relevant. So I'll end with something that made the rounds on social media 4 years ago and has started to make the rounds again. Let's hope this election makes Atwood fiction again. Thank you. Right, so I can see here, I did hear one. Oh, there's a question from George, but this is the time, people, where you get to type in your questions, you get to have these conversations with us. You can raise your hand and unmute yourself, and you can be called on and we can have a conversation. This is designed to be a really, really informal rather than a super formal, untouchable event. So please let's have a chat. While you're doing that, getting up the guts to do it, George asks, it's great to have this historical background, especially watching Kamala Age last night. Given that the vote was so hard won and that activists such as Durr were so dignified, how does the panel think we got to a point where 39% of female voters used that vote to vote for as avowed and open and misogynist as Trump in 2016? Either of you want to comment on that?
I'm quite happy to try, and I'll try to keep it as neutral as I possibly can, perhaps, and not say because they're stupid. But I think possibly we have to see Trump as a figurehead for a particular kind of conservative voter in the United States, possibly one who holds their nose while they actually look at Trump's record as a human being. But nonetheless, I think they see Trump as supporting what might be broadly described as conservative values. So he seems to, for some reason, gain the support of the evangelical right, who have very much taken on the mantle of much of what I was saying, of women who think that their role is to protect the home and the family in its very traditional, in the very traditional sense of the word, and who really have not embraced many of the changes in women's role over the course of the 20th century. So I think these are women who tend to look backwards rather than those who have, shall we say, enjoyed the privileges that the feminist movement has actually gained for them over the course of the 20th century.
I think it's also worth noting that 98% of Black women did not vote for Trump, but that's a different story. So there is definitely a racialized issue, which is not news to anyone, but certainly worth making that distinction. Anyone else have any questions or comments?
Or does George have an answer to that?
George, was there a way that you would have liked us to answer that question?
Exactly as Elizabeth did answer it. There's never a right answer or a wrong answer. There's a good answer like that one.
Thank you.
Right on. Sophie Swan, how and why did gaining the vote become such a focus for the feminist movement?
Do you want me to try and answer that one?
Yeah, go for it.
It's interesting. That is actually a very interesting question, and one that it's not that easy to answer. And indeed, at the time of the Seneca Falls Convention, the vote was actually the most controversial item on the list of demands that was put forward in the Declaration of Sentiments, and the one in which many, many women actually thought it was just simply too radical to vote for. So how it then becomes the focus of the women's rights movement in the mid-19th century is always a bit of a mystery. I think because it's something around which a lot of women pushing for the abolition of slavery thought it might help them to gain abolition. possibly also because it's the vote has always been a tool which voters can use in order to gain legislation which might gain them other rights. So I suspect the reason why the vote becomes the focus is because of that it becomes a symbol for citizenship and something that women could use to gain further rights, I think. But a very good question, thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question. So thank you so much, Sophie, and very brave for you to type in the first question as well from a student. Martin has a question that seems to me to be a yes or no question. Is it interesting to the panel that Biden's Catholic faith isn't largely seen as impairing his judgment, whereas Amy Coney Barrett's Catholic faith raises widespread fears that she will prejudge Roe v. Wade and reproductive rights debates? Is there a gender politics here or just a left-right perspective? My answer is yes. Yes, it is interesting, certainly. And there's absolutely a gender politics there. But I will say that we don't necessarily have any evidence that Amy Coney Barrett has been involved, Joe Biden lived with a Christian fundamentalist group at any point. And we don't see him, that I know of, and admittedly, I know very little in life, we don't see him having had the opportunity and decision to choose to vote against women's reproductive rights. I don't know that I can answer that anymore without kind of veering into just making stuff up. So I will stop there and start thinking about a better answer. But in the meantime, we have had more questions from students. This is fantastic. If any of you want to ask your questions with the vocal cords, you should feel free to. But in the meantime, I will read these out. So Charles Middleton, who was the first person to arrive at this meeting, so thank you very much for being so keen and early. How do you think the temperance movement affected the feminist movement?
Do you wish me to answer that one?
Oh, well, I can't answer it, so.
Okay. Ellen, do you want to say anything?
You can go ahead and then.
Okay, right. Well, I think one might say very much is the answer to that. Susan B. Anthony, who is, of course, one of the early leaders of the women's rights movement, actually came from the temperance movement rather than from the abolitionist movement. And there are quite a lot of temperance advocates in the very early women's rights movement. Similarly, in the period after the Civil War, it's organisations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union who first begin to use that rhetoric of a home protection ballot, that actually if women have the right to vote, they will vote for local option laws in order to prevent the sale of alcohol, in order to protect the home against men's drunkenness. It's also the case that when prohibition, which of course is the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, was passed, it swept away a vast amount of the opposition to women's suffrage, because the liquor interest, so-called, put up a lot of money for anti-suffrage organisations, and therefore once the 18th Amendment to the Constitution had been passed, a lot of the funding of the anti-suffrage movement ended, and it became just obvious that the liquor interest was so self-interested. I hope that answers your question.
I think it would have been great if Deborah, our colleague Deborah Toner, could have been here, because she would have answered that question from a different perspective as well. But I'm sure her ears are burning now, now that we have called her name. Message from Hannah, question from Hannah. Given how close the election is, do the panel think that Amy Coney Barrett will be confirmed as a Supreme Court judge? And if not, is there a front-runner Democratic nominee? I don't actually know if there is a front-runner Democratic nominee because I've been a little obsessed with the current Republican front-runner nominee. I don't have a sense, if I did, it would be amazing, about whether Barrett will be confirmed. I don't see why she won't be at this point. I think what will be interesting is if we do end up having a Biden-Harris win, whether they are going to try and expand the court and pack it differently to balance it out. And that's an equally interesting question, but I think that's the direction that I've been wondering in. And in fact, I was talking with Martin, another friend of ours earlier, just about this. So it is something that we need to think about because the Supreme Court, there's no actual, the Constitution doesn't list the specific number of justices that need to be on the court. It has expanded in the past, and I think FDR was trying to expand it to 15 at some point, and then had a lot of opposition to that, so that fell through. So it isn't impossible. Interestingly, when I was doing all of my reading, I didn't realize that the court was expanded in the first place because of westward expansion. So there's a plug for the American West, our Year 2 multidisciplinary module. But it certainly has expanded in the past, and I don't see why it wouldn't expand in the future if people were being savvy in one way. But on the other hand, it would lose a certain sense of legitimacy, I'd say, because the people in black robes would just be shills for politicians rather than, and it could be an ever expanding bench. So yeah, sorry, Hannah, or thank you. Grace, do you think there will ever be someone as president who will support women's right to reproduction and so on, and those of the BAME community? Sorry if it's a bit of an awkward question. It is absolutely not an awkward question. I'm fairly sure like 4 and a bit years ago, there was a president who supported those things. So it is possible. And hopefully that will happen again. But it is absolutely not a pipe dream. I don't know if either of you want to come in, Elizabeth or Ellen.
I definitely hope that it is possible. Like Zalfa said, that it has been achieved before, so let's hope for it in the future. One of the things that around that question, I think it's going to become a sense that as I know, obviously, quite a lot of people are going to say this about their own generation, but as our generation grow older, I think issues such as this hopefully will be able to be less ignored, and therefore it will be impossible for a president or anybody in particular power to be able to ignore these sort of issues or be quite blasé about them, because I think people are going to demand answers either way, and perhaps from there people will be able to make a bit more of an informed decision. So I definitely hope that it is possible and it won't be that far in the future. Fingers crossed.
And actually there have been many Democrats, particularly from the many presidents in the past, particularly from the Democratic Party, who have certainly not voiced their opposition to women's reproductive rights. I mean, notably Bill Clinton, I guess one might include in that. And it's really the presidents who are more from the Republican side, who are very much supported by the evangelical right, who are the ones who have really pushed for and actually opposing the Roe versus Wade decision. In terms of BAME rights, we can only hope, I think. Obama tried to help. Biden says he's going to help, but the proof is in the pudding, I guess.
And what a pudding that will be.
Yeah.
Right. We have a question from Freya. considering the involvement of women as either VP or presidential nominees only began to increase since the mid-1980s, why do you think it took so long for them to become involved in this wider sphere, considering activism had been apparent before? Why are they always met with so much resistance, therefore? And are Clinton and Harris a sign of things to come? I saw an amazing video on Twitter earlier today of this 11-year-old girl. Her mum was filming her, and she was striding up and down the street. And her mum was narrating, and I couldn't recognize what was happening initially. And her mum was saying, "Oh, the motorcade has arrived," and this girl kind of pretended to get out of a car. She was waving at invisible people who were kind of applauding her and cheering her on. She came straight up to the phone camera and said, "I'm Kamala Harris, and I'm the VP." The idea there, I mean, the reason that was rather so touching and inspirational is because we're starting to see more representation. I think a lack of representation meant a lack of self-recognition, and I think that's one very small factor. The other small, well, not so small factor is, and I would say this because I suppose I'm that kind of literary critic, is the patriarchy. The patriarchy is why women weren't necessarily supported. Women can be activists, but they have specific roles, as Ellen and as Elizabeth have really impressively shown us. But I will stop talking now in case Ellen and Elizabeth have something more coherent to say.
Ellen, do you want to speak to that?
I can do from perhaps say a civil rights movement sort of angle. I've been doing quite a lot of research on the roles of female leadership within the movement, and it falls into a category of sort of the organizer or the backstage sort of involvement. And I think to a certain extent that tradition of male being the leader or the presenter and then sort of females being the behind the scenes organizer involvement, even to a certain extent you could say that the Biden-Harris campaign in a way is sort of falling into that tradition versus say Hillary, that didn't happen because perhaps it was more of a vice president switch round maybe. But it's a sense that for centuries, if not eternity, women have been seen to be the organisers or the followers of power, and men have sort of taken the main role. And there's quite a few reasons why that could be the case, but I think the barriers to why that has become a reoccurring pattern are still apparent within society, and that until those barriers or those traditions tangibly change, it is going to be always difficult. But as Alpha said, the representation is crucial to changing those traditions, and I think that hopefully we're getting there, just I'm sure not quick enough for most of us.
I don't think I have anything to add to Ellen's very good answer to that question. That actually some of it is possibly about money as well, that women don't tend to have access to the resources that are necessary to run in American elections. I think we're getting there, and I think, am I not right in thinking that the last House of Representatives that was elected had the greatest number of women ever elected? Let's hope that continues.
Oh no, thank you both. I really like this question from Cicella, so thank you, Cicella. What do you think are the possible effects of an originalist or textualist approach to understanding the law? How would a rereading of it in such a way impact Black people, minorities, and women? We're seeing that already. We see that with the obsession with the Second Amendment. this textualist and originalist interpretation of the Second Amendment, which is just nonsense, in my not legal opinion, is seen by African Americans every single day, is seen by people of color every single day. The Black Lives Matter movement was galvanized by an example of someone carrying a gun because he could, and taking a dislike to a kid walking around a neighborhood. So we're seeing the detrimental effects of this sort of reading, of this sort of interpretation all the time. I think it would be far more difficult to predict how specific decisions or specific areas or statutes of the law would be affected. And I genuinely don't necessarily think people on the Supreme Court right now are flipping through things and going, oh, we can get rid of that. Oh, we can get rid of that. They are political decisions as much as they are legal decisions. And that's why SCOTUS is such an interesting and troubling place, because it is about the law, and the law is supposed to be separate from the politics, and yet it is one that is informed wholly by the politics. So yeah, I think an originalist approach can be okay if it's balanced out with, looking around. We haven't seen that for a while, I think. Again, focusing on, using an 87-year-old woman with pancreatic cancer to try and hold up Roe v. Wade, it was not a realistic approach. Did either of you want to chip in on that?
What I find interesting, of course, in this, going back to the original Constitution, is, of course, the Second Amendment actually says that there's the right to bear arms in a well-regulated militia. So what happened to that well-regulated militia part of the original intent? And certainly there's been a lot of debate among 19th century historians about earlier gun control and what that was all about when it was first mooted as part of the Bill of Rights back in the 1790s. And it would be very interesting to see what an originalist would make of the Constitution, because the Constitution doesn't allow for all kinds of executive offices. It doesn't allow for all kinds of other ways in which the American government actually runs. So I think we have to watch this space.
Ellen, do you want to come in, or are you okay?
Yeah, I would. I think as you mentioned, the Second Amendment would probably be the clearest example of that. How the context in which the law was once formed, I think, as we would all agree, needs re-evaluation. It's just who and when will do that is up in the air at the moment.
So we are coming to the end, or rather 2 minutes ago, we came to the end of our allotted time. So I think we can deal with Grace's question and maybe one more if you just really hurry and type it fast. We can always also discuss any questions that you have, any lingering questions that you have at any of the 4 upcoming events. This is a forum for conversation more generally, as well as conversation about the topic this week. So Grace's question, do you think religion, this is actually a really good way to think about closing the session. Do you think religion will always impact American politics, especially in the South? Do you think there will be fictional or non-fictional texts to come from this period that will impact society like The Handmaid's Tale did? Oh, that is a brilliant question. I'm going to have to start to think of my fictional text or non-fictional text. So in that time, do either of you want to respond, or shall we just sit quietly while I try and imagine my library?
I think sorry, Ellen.
Go ahead.
I think in terms of the question that whether religion will always affect American politics, especially in the South, It's an interesting question. I suspect it probably will do for a few years to come still. I mean, we tend to have various sort of revivalist waves in American history dating back from before the revolution. It doesn't necessarily mean it'll be that kind of conservative religion that we're seeing so much of at the moment. I mean, there might be more sort of rationalist kinds of religious faith. There might be, I mean, it's just possible we may have non-Christian forms of religion as well that have an impact upon American politics. We shall see, I think.
Yeah. I agree with Elizabeth. I think that to a certain extent, religion probably will always play a part in American politics, just because in pretty much every sense of American life, there is some legacy or deep-rooted belief in some kind of religious tradition. And I think that particularly in the South, you get a certain, this is obviously an extreme generalization, but a certain brand of American religion. And I think that the way that that's played out will perhaps always be a part of American politics, either in terms of what is in power or perhaps the restraint against what is in power.
Thank you both. I was struggling to unmute myself. We have had one final question come in. Just in response to your question, Grace, which I think is really great. Do we think that there will be fictional or non-fictional texts to come from this period that will impact society the way The Handmaid's Tale did? I don't think The Handmaid's Tale had an effect on society in an especially different or exceptional way. I think it's one that's been picked up and returned to because it's seen weirdly as prophetic. You could read, and we do, texts by African Americans at mid-century, by abolitionists in the 19th century, like Frederick Douglass, that have and continue to impact society then and today. And arguably, Frederick Douglass's work and Henry Brooks Brown and all of these people who were writing at the time had a bigger impact than Margaret Atwood. So we will see, and we are seeing, an amazing body of literary and non-fiction text coming out of the US and the world at this time. And I'm just listing two here because I got into such a tizzy that I couldn't remember any of the books that I like to read. But anything by Jasmine Ward, who very recently wrote a really devastating article. Please look it up, or I'll pop it into the chat later on losing her husband to COVID-19. She's a really important novelist. Thinking about Katrina and Black Lives Matter and a whole range of topics that are really, really relevant and will continue to remain relevant to us. Claudia Rankine, the American poet, who has just come, her most recent collection came out, I think, earlier this month or September. So that there are texts that are going to change the world, but all literary texts change the world in one way or another, I'd say, even the bad ones, even the racist ones, unfortunately. So we've suddenly gotten another question. Right, Martin's will be our last question. I'm drawing the line. So David's question first. In Florida, people who used to be in prison and have been released are currently forced to pay off their court debts and fees in order to be allowed to vote. Should this be considered a new poll tax? Yes, absolutely. Ellen, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I completely agree. In the sense that if you look at poll tax as a sort of element of a wider range of measures that were enforced to disenfranchise African Americans, poor whites, women, a whole range of groups. A poll tax was seen as a sort of economic measure to restrict anybody that was deemed unworthy of shaping America's future. And I think that even in a sense of a poll tax that, for example, Durr was fighting against may no longer exist. There are definitely other elements of a need or a want to disenfranchise particular people from voting. And as you say, the fact that prisoners need to pay back like their court debts is a form of poll tax that stops a certain group of voting and disenfranchises people within American society.
Yeah, absolutely, David. Okay, so finally, Martin's question. Do you think that this is a question that I don't know if we can answer, but if we can correctly, then we should also figure out the lotto numbers for whenever the lotto is being played. Do you think that by 2024, American voters will be ready for President Harris or Warren or Klobuchar? I hope so.
I hope so. I suspect the first female president will actually be a Republican. Simply because Republicans are not going to vote for somebody like certainly the women that Martin mentions here. I think they're just A, they're women, and B, their politics are too left-wing for most Americans. Ellen, perhaps you can be more hopeful than I am.
No,
yeah, I was going to say.
I agree. I think that, well, I hope that it will happen soon, but how can you tell? I think that perhaps the election, well, the Trump election, we were in a position of, well, I think quite a few people were, that was going to be the year that there was a female president, when we were living through that election where it would be changing, sort of echoing the Obama election, that I think as everybody watched, they could feel a sense that America and consequently the world was changing, and that because that didn't happen with Hillary Clinton, there's a sense of surely it's going to happen soon. But then again, that could perhaps be a completely naive statement. And as Elizabeth said, I think that female president is possible, but it's what the female president would stand for that would probably dictate when she possibly would be elected.
We might, of course, get a female president before 2024.
Yeah.
Oh, well, now we're going into amazing speculation. I'm loving this.
Given what Biden looks like at the moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's 7:10. I'm just all of us were just so delighted that everybody who has turned up actually turned up and mostly stayed. Thank you, everyone, for all of your amazing questions and for participating and for listening. We are going to be here same time next week, 6 p.m. on Thursday, to talk about the US election in the Americas. Different lineup, same vibe. So please do come along then. Thank you so much to our contributors, Ellen Morgan and Elizabeth Clapp. Have a great evening and wash your hands. Bye, everyone.